Good morning, or good afternoon, or good night. Today I'm going to show you work that sort of what started happening in the world of photography after World War II and into the 50s and even 60s as the world was rapidly changing. So at the time, that's called the Atomic Age. Pretty good, huh? Um, So until and during World War II, modernism reigned with people like eventually Stieglitz and Edward Weston, Ansel Adams on the West Coast. Um, it was reinforced by popular photo magazines and the FSA, the Photo League, and even MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the George Eastman House in Rochester, and Beaumont and Nancy Newhall, who I'll talk about a little bit later today, who are very important people in the pushing forward of photography. Here is Ansel Adams, a show of his, and some of the modernism that you see with his landscapes, Moonrise over Hernandez, New Mexico. Very sharp, very rich, um, and illustrative. Uh, Here are two images from the Bauhaus, which was born in Germany. That was really sort of one of the major pinnacles of modernism and gave birth to some of the early surrealists. But in these images, you can tell that sort of modernist aesthetic, both in the photographed compositional form as well as the architecture that is being shown. The Bauhaus is also really known for their contributions to modern architecture, things like those balconies that you see. And then in 1933, the Bauhaus was closed by the Nazis, and then in 1937, the then head of the Bauhaus, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, came to Chicago and started the new Bauhaus, which was based on the German model. Um, and he wrote, the old Bauhaus, an art university, established the principles that mass production of goods and modern architecture needed not only engineers, but also artists with fresh mentality and exact information about old and new materials. Um, and it only lasted a few years as the new Bauhaus before it became known as the Institute of Design. Um, Another thing that's happening right after the war that is photographed by Dorothea Lange extensively is the Japanese internment. So, while working on assignment for the WRA, with the War Relocation Authority, during World War II, Dorothea Lange photographed the evacuation and internment of Japanese Americans in camps. Her photographs captured life in the internment camps and the often raw emotions that were displayed by the people who were taken from their homes to live in these camps. Um, so that same sort of social document that she applied to the Great Depression is now being applied to internment camps. She was eager to take the commission, despite being opposed to the effort, because she believed, quote, a true record of the evacuation would be valuable in the future. So really taking that the what she learned from working for the FSA. And when you first look at a lot of these, they they're taken in the early 1940s, but they appear to show sort of ordinary activities. People wait patiently in lines. Children play. A woman makes artificial flowers. While a storefront proudly proclaim, "I am an American." And these pictures were commissioned by the federal government as part of its documentary programs, but they were eventually actually suppressed for the duration of the war, and never actively distributed. Her prints were sometimes defaced by military personnel with the word "impounded" scrawled across them. After the war ended, the photographs were discreetly deposited in the National Archives without much fanfare, where they remained largely unseen and unpublished for decades. And it was in 1980, uh, so 40 years after this, that the Jimmy Carter administration determined the internment was unjust and recommended reparations for the survivors up to $20,000. And then in 1988, Ronald Reagan's Congress signed legislation that officially apologized for the internment on behalf of the U.S., stating that the government actions were based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Another person who was photographing here was Ansel Adams at the Manzanar relocation camp. He said, "The purpose of my work was to show how these people, suffering under great injustice and loss of property, businesses, and professions, had overcome the sense of defeat and despair by building for themselves a vital community in an arid but magnificent environment. All in all, I think this Manzanar collection is an important historical document, and I trust it can be put to good use." And so you see his pictures are a little more upbeat than Dorothea Lange's, showing sort of positivity in these camps. A major difference from what the work that Ansel Adams is known for. This is not at all what we think about when we think about Ansel Adams, but he was approaching it with the same idea, but trying to sort of bring a positivity to it. And so this sort of underlying anxiety that we start to see starts to give birth to some new versions of surrealists, like Clarence John Laughlin, who was a self-taught photographer from New Orleans, and his rocky childhood and Southern heritage and a deep interest in literature, it really influenced his work. He was a devotee of the French symbolist poets and surrealism. The French symbolist poets are people like Rimbaud and Baudelaire, who have a sort of darkness to their poetry. The war produced an influx and wide variety of European immigrants and philosophy. Oh, that's not the right thing. Sorry. And you can see how that sort of darkness is drawing inspiration even from things like Nosferatu. As I mentioned, he was self-educated and he self-taught as a photographer, but also he dropped out of school and self-educated, but he was highly literate, really in love with books. And he had a large vocabulary, a love of language, which is evident, and he would have these elaborate captions like "Haunter of Ruins" here. He would later write to accompany his photographs. His early aspiration was to be a writer, and he wrote many poems and stories in the style of those French symbolist poets, such as Rimbaud and Baudelaire. His father cultivated and encouraged his lifelong love of literature, and when his father died in 1918, Laughlin was devastated. And it was also then that his grief was really compounded by a priest's false promise that God would save his ailing parent if he prayed hard enough. And that left Laughlin with a deep suspicion of religion that would often surface in his work with religious motifs. As well, his work has many elements of surrealism, as we've seen with such people like Man Ray and Moholy-Nagy, but which is, at the time, it was much more common in European photography, and a lot of historians they actually credit him with being the first true surrealist in the United States. And his work has a lot of these elements like that. This is supposed to be was often likened to people like Atget, who was using that sort of glowing light. Another person who is thinking in this sort of similar vein is Frederick Sommer. This is a photograph, a double exposure of Max Ernst, who's a surrealist painter. But the subjects of his pictures are very diverse. They range from disorienting landscapes and macabre aspects of the natural world to these surreal arrangements of found objects and pure abstractions. Yet there's also a distinct vision that connects all his work. Sommer's photographs, they show an abiding interest in form and a consistently startling approach to composition, texture, and scale. His writings reference the hidden structure that he saw in all around him, and the beauty of which he sought to reveal in the images. He writes, "As artists, we are custodians of order, and in ordering a collection, we also learn what it is." It was after visiting Stieglitz in New York and meeting Edward West in California that young Frederick Sommer embraced the creative possibilities of the camera, and he began crafting a body of work unparalleled in its experimental qualities. And it was artists like Charles Sheeler and Max Ernst, who I mentioned, encouraged his exploration into the sensitized surface rather than the photography itself. In an image like this, 8 young roosters, where these are all these parts of the chicken, you can see he was using sort of this positivist, like Karl Blossfeld, of the reality of what's there, but there's a certain amount of subversion by using the dead chicken. And this abstract expressionism, which was an important predecessor to surrealism with its emphasis on spontaneous, automatic, or subconscious creation. Frederick Sommer lived in, he moved at some point to Arizona, where he lived his whole life and created most of his work, sort of outside the sphere of the art world. But he found the Arizona landscape was imbued with a surrealist quality that resonated with his unique aesthetic sensibilities, with a formal elegance and a cool exactitude, coupled with a penchant for the emotionally charged and sometimes even shocking macabre. So you see in an image like this, where this expanse has no beginning or ending, is this really related, similar to something like a Jackson Pollock here, as an example, which was the abstract expressionism, which was born out of surrealism, but comes after World War II, mostly in painting. It was developed in the 40s, and it was the first sort of specifically American movement to achieve international influence, which put New York City at the center of the Western world, which used to be filled by Paris in the art world. Minor White is a photographer who used visual metaphor to access the mythical nature within reality. He was deeply influenced by those Alfred Stieglitz equivalents that I showed right at the beginning, and he actually converted to Catholicism while he was in World War II, but after this angst of serving in the war, he resulted in his a religious exploration into mysticism and Zen Buddhism, and the Gestalt psychology of Gurdjieff. He took the belief that photographs don't actually hold their own meanings, but rather an image contains a multitude of meanings, and the viewer or the audience are the source of those meanings. And during the Cold War era, where the communists were hunting for the blacklist, witch hunts and blacklists, artists and intellectuals turned away from activist social encounters, searching an inward path of myth and transcendence, which is when he turns to Stieglitz equivalents as a form of Zen meditation. And it was like Stieglitz that White believed that the essence of photography's claim to being an art lay in its metaphoric capability, and that he felt that photographic representation was inherently symbolic. That camera images revealed not only their subjects, but also their inner lives and their makers. And it was this tenet which was fundamental to photography's version of modernism, which then was replaced by the postmodernist notion that photographs reveal cultural codes, not personal truths. And he said, once the image is liberated from the burden of representation, the viewer could subjectively read an image for personal meaning. And perhaps his biggest impact on photography was that he was the founding editor of Aperture magazine, which still exists today. It was a consortium of photographers including Ansel Adams, Dorothea Lange, Barbara Morgan, Beaumont, and Nancy Newhall, and Minor White. And it was the first journal since camera work, Stieglitz's camera work, that looked at photography specifically as a fine art itself. He also became somewhat of a photo guru, where he taught classes and workshops and retreats at the California School of Fine Arts, later the San Francisco Art Institute, at RIT for a long time, and then finally at MIT in Boston. He was an assistant curator of exhibitions at the George Eastman House in Rochester. And he had a really unorthodox way of teaching, which included horoscopes for all prospective students who came away both mystified and enlightened by the experience. Harry Callahan purchased his first camera in 1938 when he was 20. He was a 26-year-old clerk in the shipping department at Chrysler in Detroit. And while there, he joined the Chrysler Camera Club. Chrysler has a famed photography collection, actually. And then the Detroit Photo Guild. It was in 1941 that he met Ansel Adams while taking a workshop with him. And he learned the value of a very precise print. And it was in 1946 then that he was invited by Moholy-Nagy to teach at the Institute of Design in Chicago, where he taught for a number of years before he moved to Rhode Island in 1961, and started the photography department at RISD until he retired in 1977. He died in 1999. His early street photos were this. He sort of typified this post-war isolation, where he would use a telephoto lens and sort of fill the frame with these individual heads lost in the crowd, or alone as they pass by on this empty street, which show the confusion and disorientation of this nuclear era. His work was deeply personal, and he encouraged students to turn their cameras on their own lives. This is later work, obviously. He said that he thought that photography was about learning to control the visual gestalt of the pictures. The photographer's mental organization is what determines how an image is put together and therefore determines its meaning. And you can see where he's sort of drawing inspiration from people like Moholy-Nagy and this Bauhaus modernism, but turning things inward on his own life, like these porch chairs, deck chairs. Using a photograph to both abstract but find the deeper emotional context. In the summer of 1942, he traveled to New York to meet Alfred Stieglitz, whose series of his wife, Georgia O'Keeffe, inspired him to begin this decades-long collaboration of portraits with his wife, Eleanor, and who sort of became essential to his images for probably more than it was almost 20 years, where he photographed her everywhere. His work can kind of be arranged under themes of Eleanor, the city, and landscape, but like White, he saw form as a path to the spirit. So even when he's photographing subjects that are as personal and loved as his wife and child, the images sort of remain unsentimental, with the underlying construct being the image itself. Where he places her as a figure in the landscape to break up the natural field, or as a silhouette in the water, where the image of who she is less important than the form that the photograph takes, or this striking image of the gaze. But again, it's loving and sincere and deep, but perhaps not totally. It could sort of be anybody, but it certainly helps that it's someone as important as his wife. He then, Callahan starts working closely with somebody named Aaron Siskind, who originally was a member of the Photo League in New York, who was producing socially conscious images in the 1930s when he begins his career. But he eventually dropped out of the Photo League to pursue the work that was more abstract and personal. I'm going to talk for a minute about this early work. This is a portfolio called the Harlem Document that reveals Harlem in the 1930s, when it was no longer a cultural center, but hadn't kind of completely disintegrated into what it became in the middle of the 20th century up until 20 years ago. The country was in the 30s in the middle of the Great Depression and the Harlem Renaissance at the time. with its community of intellectuals and artists who celebrated the black experience in literature, visual art, and music was on decline. At the time, when he was part of the Photo League, which was committed to these documenting social issues, and you can see he's using this example with the Walker Evans photograph. To his photograph is an example of that visual language of the time. The Walker Evans photograph of this fish market during the Great Depression is in 1936, and Siskin's photograph of this deli worker at the grocery store is from 1940. A notable thing about the Harlem document is that Aaron Siskin is white, and his subjects are pretty much all black. But at the time, and this is at a time when there was a lot of prejudice and racial tension, but he managed, by sort of becoming part of the community there, he became an accepted presence in the area documenting. These images were exhibited as a group at least once, but didn't really receive much attention. Siskin, he moved from this documentary style to a more aesthetic style in which he created abstract images from natural forms that later made him famous and furthered the argument for photography as an art form. And this Harlem document is in 1981, where only 57 of them were published in this small edition book form, with an introduction by Gordon Parks from the FSA. But it was in 1990 that at the Smithsonian exhibits them, and a reissue of the book that brought it to the larger spotlight. I'm gonna come back to Aaron Siskin in a minute, but while we're in Harlem, I need to talk about Roy DeCarava. So Roy DeCarava is photographing Harlem, and he's born there. He's born there in 1919. And he really came of age during the Harlem Renaissance, so at the same time that Aaron Siskin's working. But this artistic activity and achievement among African Americans was flourishing across literary, musical, dramatic, and visual arts. He didn't actually take up photography until the late 40s. He had been working in painting and making prints for the poster divisions of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which was a program started under the Great Depression. He was trained to be a painter, but he would use a camera to gather images for his printmaking work and painting work. And he started to gravitate toward photography, partly because of its immediacy, but also because of the limitations he saw all around him for a black artist in a segregated nation. He said a black painter to be an artist had to join the white world of not function, and had to accept the values of white culture. Sorry, my notes are weird there. So to say it again, a black painter to be an artist had to join the white world or not function, and had to accept the values of white culture, which he did. He wanted to portray his own culture in his own way. He worked a lot with Edward Steichen, and at Edward Steichen's urging, DeCarava applied for and then won a Guggenheim in 1952, becoming the first African-American photographer to receive the honor. That fellowship enabled him to spend a year shooting hundreds of photographs documenting Harlem life. And eventually Steichen would include several of these photographs in the 1955 exhibition, The Family of Man, which I will also talk about later today. He said, I do not want a documentary or sociological statement about these pictures. He wrote in the application for the Guggenheim Fellowship. So he wrote in that fellowship, I do not want a documentary or sociological statement. And his goal was, as he explained, a creative expression, the kind of penetrating insight and understanding of Negroes, which I believe only a Negro photographer can interpret. So these images, he didn't want it to be, say, like Edward Curtis, an outsider looking in. He wanted to be part of the community photographing it, which is a notable difference from how Siskin is photographing despite his best efforts. No photographer before him had pictured this sort of domestic life of black or white with such this unsentimental tenderness. And over his over 60-year career, he fiercely guarded the manner in which his work was exhibited, and the visibility in the art world remained low for decades because of that. He came to be regarded as the founder of a school of African American photography that broke with the social documentation tradition of his time. He was an outspoken crusader for civil rights, and he felt that his pictures would speak louder as a record of black life in America if they abandoned the overtly humanist aims of mentors like Edward Steichen. This picture here, Shirley Embracing Sam, appeared in De Carava's book, The Sweet Flypaper of Life, in 1955, which had a text by the American poet Langston Hughes. The book has been praised as a sympathetic view of everyday life in Harlem, drawn by two members of the community rather than a visiting sociologist or reformers, with images such as people like Mahalia Jackson singing. And the book was recently reissued just a year or two ago. So returning to Aaron Siskind, well, I mentioned a lot about how he sort of moved into this abstract expressionism, and this is what he's really known for. He was seeking to convey not only the physical characteristics of these subjects, but also whatever potential they had to evoke emotion. And in 1945, he published a collection of these works called The Drama of Objects. And it really spoke with this work of a group of painters in New York City who the following year would be given the name Abstract Expressionists. He met Harry Callahan in 1950, who persuaded him to join him at the faculty at the Institute of Design in Chicago, formerly the new Bauhaus. And when Harry Callahan moved to start the program at RISD, he brought Aaron Siskind with him. The radical anti-formalist movement of the 60s and 70s was sort of adopted him with his, groups like the Fluxus groups, which is what Yoko Ono was really known for, Neo-Dada, conceptual art, and the feminist movement, and all of these things can be traced to the innovations of abstract expressionism. In his abstract pieces, Siskind really strived to include the same formal aesthetic qualities one might find in a painting of the time. Though they're flattened on the photographic plane, on the paper, he still was able to convey texture, depth, and perspective. Though the marks were not made by his own actions, he still was expressing their energy and the power of physical gestures. And he was this sort of lyricism and the relationship by harmoniously arriving at the perfect composition. Even though they're abstract, they possess an undeniable content, but he's subverting that content by offering new interpretive possibilities based on the feelings the images convey. Later, digging deeper into the potential for photography to communicate on an abstract level, he created a series of pieces he called The Pleasures and Terrors of Levitation in the late 50s. The series consists of these high-speed photographs of shadowy human figures frozen in midair in athletic postures set against stark white backgrounds, making it unclear for the viewer to know if they are falling or floating. And Charles Traub, who is the chair of the Aaron Siskind Foundation for a while, he says, "I remember quite clearly Aaron's delight at the Chicago waterfront where these images were taken. He was particularly enamored of teenagers, their unabashed frolicking and daring, their inherent athleticism. Aaron loved ordinary people, the sights, sounds, and activities that were off the beaten path of the city." So just really fun and playful as these young men float through the air. So a major thing that is happening now is how we are taking in photography. We have the news magazines. Photography is throughout newspapers at this point, and it's able to be reproduced in publications quite easily. And you have fashion, and so our visual language is growing rapidly with photography being incorporated. But it is also how it's deemed as a fine art, and how it's being ingested as a fine art. And so in the early 1900s, this is what a photo exhibition looked like, which is called a salon style. Like you can see that the images are hung all the way to the floor, all the way to the ceiling practically, with an abundance of information to take in. And here's another view. You see the stereoscopes in the middle, different cameras. It's a little bit more of a trade show. And it was Stieglitz's gallery, Gallery 291, that sort of formalizes this image viewing. As you can see, everything's sort of hung at eye level, and you're meant to move through the room, looking at one image at a time. In 1929, just days after the Wall Street crash, MoMA opens, and then it's moved to West 53rd Street, where it still is today, and was recently renovated, almost 20 years ago, but is sort of the epicenter of modern art. It's a massive, massive building. It's wild to go there on any given day. Thousands of people passing through there, looking at it, at everything that they have. But a wonderful museum. And it was in 1938 that MoMA has its first solo photography show, and that's a show given to Walker Evans about his American photographs, that included photos from the FSA, but even more than that, it had photos from the photos on the subway and everything. And this is their press release for the first one-person photo exhibit. In 1940, an art historian named by the name of Beaumont Newhall, and he's a photographer. He became a librarian at MoMA, and later the curator of the photo department. And he was invited to develop the first comprehensive history of photo exhibition along with this catalog, which for many, many years was the textbook that was used to teach the history of photography over the first 100 years of his life. So 1940, 1840, 100 years. He actually left MoMA when he learned Edward Steichen was then hired to be the director of the photography department while he was going to remain a curator. And he moved on to become the curator of the Eastman House Museum of Photo. He often worked with his wife, Nancy. They kind of were a pair, and when he actually went to war, she took over for him. He fought in World War II, and she took over all his responsibilities at the Eastman House. And they would have a long career together of teaching and everything. And so these are scenes from this exhibition of the history of photography. And you can see all the major differences of how we start to view museum shows. Even from Gallery 291, which is sort of formalized, in this we have these sort of massive introduction things and a timeline, 1839, of a guy with a camera, assuming he's probably Daguerre. And then to this more modern photograph of a guy with a 35 millimeter camera that's just your any day person. There is the vitrines that house the daguerreotypes and other smaller ephemera from the time, to work us through the 100 years of photography, as well as this more contemporary way of viewing images. These are hung by Pictureline and meant to go image by image. So it encompasses the whole thing. And then in 1955, this show, The Family of Man, was curated by Edward Steichen, and it then would tour the world for 8 years. And it stopped in 37 countries. More than 9 million people have viewed the exhibit, probably more. And this image here by Wynne Bullock, called Child in a Forest, it symbolized the mythical first woman, and Steichen chose it as the show's opening piece. So when you walked in, you'd see this image. And Steichen's aim was to present the universal experience of human existence and the essential goodness of humanity and people. And Eugene Smith's A Walk to Paradise Garden, which was one of the images that was widely used to publicize the show, was also the final image. And if you remember from the last lecture, this image was, Eugene Smith created this image sort of because he needed to make an image of goodness, because of all the horrors he saw in World War II. So my personal belief is that this image is incredibly saccharine and hokey, and has definitely aged poorly, if it ever was decent to begin with. But it was this walking out, what the innocence of that. Steichen was relying heavily on the photograph's symbolism of hope and innocence to convey this humanist message. It becomes a catalog, which has been published and republished God knows how many times. You can see the sort of Art Deco cover. And the Family of Man, it really represents this culmination of Edward Steichen's career. At this point, he's an older man. If you remember, we've talked about him so much over the course of these lectures. He sort of got a start in pictorialism and then moved into modernism and fashion and worked in Condé Nast. And here he is as a director of the photography department and creating this massive exhibition. And what he did is he tried to match this democratic premise that all people were the same no matter where they're from. So he didn't treat the photographs as an individual's work, but rather pieces of a larger tapestry, which was pretty similar to the magazine practice at the time, where the photographer would give up control to editors who then take over their contextual meaning. The way it was hung allowed viewers to read the show as a photo essay about this human development and the cycles of life. As you see on the right there, the sort of birth and babies. And then towards the end of the exhibit, which is perhaps the most editorial thing that he put in there, he included a black painted room with a 6x8. It was actually a backlit, illuminated transparency, which was an image of an H-bomb blast at Bikini Atoll, which implied this moral choice that the viewers had to make if they wanted to keep the Family of Man going. And now it's permanently installed at Chateau Clairvaux in Luxembourg, which is where Steichen eventually retired, and it was his home. Many images that would show this sort of worldly comparisons. Steichen's brother-in-law, who is the poet Carl Sandburg, wrote this accompanying text that was displayed as text panels sort of throughout the exhibit that said, "We too form a multitude." And when Steichen leaves, his predecessor is this man, John Szarkowski, who really takes over this major influence on the direction of where fine art photography goes. You can see here this hanging, which is pretty much how we see a lot of photography today. If you were to go to the museum, where you have images hung in groups, separated as breaks. Right? There's an Andy Warhol. Some of the people he starts to champion are people who are really looking at this new way of seeing photography. Even though this is very documentary in style, it's a different approach to it. And this is Robert Frank, and I'm only going to talk about his work, The Americans, that was photographed in the 50s. The way that he got, he was able to do this for 2 years. Went on numerous road trips across the country, sometimes with his family, sometimes with not. And he got a Guggenheim grant, which is this major grant, still is given out today, where this very sort of simple use, and it says, "I'm applying for a fellowship with a very simple intention. I wish to continue, develop, and widen the kind of work I already do and have been doing for some 10 years, and apply it to the American nation in general." So he just kind of talks about what he wants to do, and all of these, a small catalog comes to the mind's eye. So he wants to put together a book. Very simple. It's published first in 1958. It was nobody would pick it up in the U.S., so it's published in France, and initially receiving really harsh reviews, kind of perceived as derogatory towards American ideals, as well as his sort of handheld reportage style, which was considered amateur, with things like Popular Photography magazine calling his images meaningless blur, grain, muddy exposure, drunken horizons, and general sloppiness. And some of the topics that he's looking at is in the 50s in this country, in America, there's this idea, this sort of like cultural boom where things are going well. It's post-war. Everyone is sort of coming together, and you know, it's cookie cutter lifestyle, right? This really the suburban dream is born. But Robert Frank is starting to look at some of the other things that are happening that are sort of less on the forefront of what we would like to consider as American, like racism in New Orleans. Things that are a little more like the Beat Poets. This is a picture where he's picked up two hitchhikers and has them drive the car for him. Lonely expanses of road, empty gas stations that say save. So what these images start to do is convey this sense of longing and isolation that was actually felt sort of throughout the country in this post-war era. He uses these sort of metaphors like a jukebox, which is an American thing. The honky tonk or the juke joint is this very American idea of like going out dancing at the bar. And here he's including it as this image of loneliness. Sort of making American juxtapositions of the sad-eyed waitress with the happy Santa Claus. Or the lonely elevator girl surrounded by demons. The opening to this work was written by Jack Kerouac, and that really gives it this sort of beat and tenor that was really felt in the work. Class issues, race issues, American issues. And in the end, the individual image matters a lot less than how they are sequenced together, and how we're meant to view this as a body of work that flows from one image to the next. In the end, of 68 photographs in this book, and you turn page to page where there's runs of criticism from image to image rather than criticism just in one image. The final image is of his wife at the time and their son in the car. Again, doesn't matter that it's his wife, but it's that lonely road early in the morning, possibly as the driver has gotten out to stretch his legs. Somebody who is deeply inspired by him is a lesser-known photographer named Dave Heath, who also is puts together this sort of seminal work called Dialogues with Solitude, which is maybe a little bit more to the point. He's using work that he created from the Korean War and into his life in Washington Square Park and in Chicago. But his images are really psychologically charged, and they reflect and respond to this alienation that's happening throughout this post-war North American society. He's one of this new generation of artists that's seeking new ways to try and make sense of this increasing sense of isolation and the vulnerability that typified this age. With the work feeling really involved with how Frank is working with this narrative and poetic version of itself, where the interior reality takes precedence. And his preoccupations with solitude and contemplation really make explicit the importance of sequencing in his practice, how one image leads to the next. He was clear that the central issue of it, and this is what he says, is the central issue of my work is sequence. And he held a belief that the relativity and rhythm of images offered a truer way of conveying a universal psychological state than a single image. William Klein, who actually expatriated to France, and he really was rebelling against the 50s notion of the decisive moment, which included this sort of dogmatic principle of never intervening in the scene, that everything should be real. And he does that by making eye contact, letting really actively becoming part of the image. And he is including these unconventional elements like blur, where he's sometimes not even looking through the viewfinder. And really never trying to be that fly on the wall that people like Cartier-Bresson and the war photographers were trying to do, but rather be a provocateur, to get an image from his subjects that pushes us forward. Often he'd catch his subject staring right back at us, which really lets us know that he's in the image, and that he was part of the cause for this reaction. Richard Hamilton was a collage artist who was using visual juxtapositions to capture the frenetic energy of television and remind us how strange the vacuum, tape recorder, and radio must have been to these first generations that experienced them. And it's actually this image here where you can see it on that lollipop that the bodybuilder is holding, where it says, it's, pop, Tootsie Pop. But it's the first time we see pop in relationship to art. So he's sort of known as the godfather of pop art, which would of course include people like Roy Lichtenstein and Andy Warhol and some of these major figures of 20th century contemporary art. He said, "It's not so easy to create a memorable image. Art is made through the sensibilities of an artist and the kind of ambitions and intelligence, curiosity and inner direction that role requires." And he worked until making these sort of social commentaries until he died in the later 90s, I believe. And finally, this is a sort of interesting moment about subjectivity and the real and fantasy of Robert Doisneau, who I have talked about before, about the moving image. And this is The Kiss by the Hotel de Ville. And this image, for years, people thought it was this sort of Cartier-Bresson moment, right? This moment that was captured. Well, in essence, it was two models that were meant to convey this, and he had them, different people kissing throughout town. And the Hotel de Ville Lovers, which is part of this series, which had already been worked on, which, this is what he says, which I had already worked on for a week, and which I had to complete with 2 or 3 photos of that kind. But the fact that they were set up never bothered me. After all, nothing is more subjective than l'objectif, which is the French word for lens. We never show things as they really are. The world I was trying to present was one where I would feel good, where people would be friendly, where I could find the tenderness I longed for. My photos were like a proof that such a world could exist, but in reality are made up. These pictures were taken for a photo spread about Paris lovers in Life magazine. But this image stayed in that first image I showed you stayed in the archive of his photo agency for more than 30 years before it was commercialized by a poster company. So it sort of becomes something else. This is what he said about it. Photography is not a document on which a report can be made. It is a subjective document. Photography is a false witness, a lie. People want to prove the universe is there. It is a physical image that contains a certain amount of documentation, which is fine, but it isn't evidence, a testimony upon which a general philosophy can be based. And with that, I will leave you, and I will talk to you soon, and hope you are all well.